Thank you, everyone. Welcome back to the Pranic World Festival. We're live here in Kokore, Italy at the Eden Pranic Center. For those of you joining online, we have the ability to go to the small little world symbol at the bottom of your screen. It says interpretation. And you can listen in an alternate language. Just a small announcement that unfortunately the Spanish language translation isn't active just now. She might be able to join us shortly. But for everyone else, we have French, Russian, and Italian translation. Also, for those of you joining online, please feel free to write your questions for Janelle into the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. And we will do our best to answer those questions by the end of the presentation. I'm very excited to present Janelle. She's going to be sharing the story of her great-grandmother who was also living a pranic lifestyle. And welcome, Janelle. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. And I will tell you now, I'm nervous to be here.
You've got a bunch of beautiful people just welcoming you, and yes, don't be shy.
All right, so today I will be sharing a historical perspective on what it was like to eat less food in America during the Great Depression. So today I'm sharing about my great-grandmother, Martha Nash. She came to, her family came to America in 1880 from Prussia. She was a first-born American, raised in a time when many Americans struggled to put food on the table. She was raised in a very religious family, and to follow tradition would have been very important, especially so during World War I, when she was growing up.
Sorry for the disruption, Janelle. That was just one of our translators coming back online.
Thank you.
Go ahead, and thank you for speaking so slowly and clearly.
In times of World War I in America, there was well-known anti-German discrimination, and very violent in that case. So as my great-grandmother was becoming an adult and starting in her marriage, many people would say she could not speak her own language. She could not practice her cultural traditions. And they were very oppressed at this time. She went through the first 8 years of her marriage with no children. This again in our family would have been strange. Many families would have 10 children, and she couldn't. She came from a place of being oppressed and being depressed because of who she was and because of her culture, who she was. So, before I go more into her story, I want to preface that what Dominique spoke about yesterday, of having and knowing the love of God, the love of a Father to help support us when we are going through emotional challenges, is an essential biological need for our bodies to find rest and peace. And for many years, my great-grandmother Martha felt distance from God, felt betrayed and forsaken, and perhaps that contributed to a delayed or prolonged aha moment for her, if you will. So we need to remember that in this story. So at the beginning, we have my great-grandmother, Martha. She married Louis Nash, another German. He was a commercial painter, and she had worked at a hospital. But as soon as they got married, she must stop work. Her dreams, her future had come to an end. He wasn't able to have continuous work. They were on welfare on top of the Great Depression and German oppression. It's a tough time for her. In 1921, they had their first and only child, my grandfather, Ralph. He grew up knowing a mother constantly strained and depressed. He knew that she wrote beautiful poetry. He knew she was intelligent and educated. He knew they sort of loved each other, but he felt distance from her as well. Until he became an adult and they were able to reconnect at a different level. In 1926 or 7, my great-grandfather Louis was out for 5 months. He had to go to another state to find work. And at this time, my grandfather was 6, and my great-grandmother needed help. We don't know what was going on beside depression and general, like her world was falling apart, perhaps. World War II was over, World War I was over, World War II was on the cusp, coming, and the depression was coming. And she took the opportunity to go to a surgeon when she was 37 with no husband to have a procedure of unknown origin, which now we think, okay, I'm a woman, I have something wrong, I go get help. But back then, without her husband's permission, that was not okay. What she did was in secret. What she did might have not been allowed, which makes the family believe that it had something to do with hormones, or perhaps a child that did not survive. We know that right before this surgery, she found out her husband was cheating on her. So perhaps this had something to do with maybe a punishment to kill the baby or to stop having babies or whatever that might be. She was full of bitterness at that time. When she woke up from the surgery, she reported to her doctor that she could no longer taste. She had trouble sensing food. She had no appetite anymore. She could not sleep anymore. So now, with 100 years of medical case studies, we have been able to pin down that something happened when the doctors intubated. Back then, There are no anesthesiologists. The doctor would put the tube in, walk away, and go work on something else. When that happens and the tubes are not being monitored, pressure can be applied to the lingual nerve that runs through the jaw under the teeth. That nerve runs up to our pons nerve bundle. And this affects our ability to taste. But also, this nerve bundle is directly connected to our spine and our nervous system. So from that day forward, she had anxiety and depression amplified. But also, she could not taste her food. I believe this was the point where she had come to her all-time low. Maybe some people who have experienced COVID can relate having dysgeusia, where the food in your mouth has no flavor, or where the food in your mouth tastes like poison. I did for 2 weeks. I put the food in my mouth. I made the food. I knew it was safe. But as soon as it touched my tongue, I believed it was poison. I told my children, spit it out, spit it out. And they were scared. What's wrong with mom? It caused anxiety, if you can imagine. Also, after the surgery, my great-grandmother could not walk for 3 months. She had no wheelchair. This is the wagon she sat in. Makes us think maybe it was gynecological again. In the 6 months after her surgery, she continued to struggle with the anxiety, the inability to be who she was. She complained of the eating situation a lot, and her family worried, and the doctors worried, and the doctors had no answers. Back then, no doctor would admit to having any kind of malpractice during a surgery, especially a surgery that was done secretly without the husband present, without the husband's permission. Martha was in trouble. Her situation became a source of embarrassment for the family as well. What do you do with a good German woman who will not eat, who will not drink? What do you do in a time when she was behaving inappropriately? More like, what does a husband do to a wife that is behaving inappropriately? Well, for her, the answer was to be committed to the Minnesota State Hospital for the Insane. She received an evaluation, and they determined her to have a case of nerves. They determined that she should be force-fed. They determined maybe she was suicidal because she refused food. And that made her a danger to society at that time in 1928. Refusing food and being a danger to society resulted easily in a sentencing. She did not go until she got better. She went and was sentenced like a criminal. I don't like that. These are the outfits they used to put the patients in. While my great-grandmother, was in the asylum, she was subjected to force feeding with a tube. She was subjected to being placed in a Utica crib. We know they had 4 on the campus, and we know they were used for punishment if she escaped. And she escaped twice. I'm very proud. We know she was subjected to electrotherapy, shock in the brain, to try and get her to change her mind. When she said, "I don't need food," they thought they could change her mind by shocking her. After 6.5 years, she was released on parole. And she looked, in her driver's license photo, she looked okay. She was not dehydrated. She was not malnourished. She was not fatigued. She was not dead. Everyone expected her to be dead. But here's how I believe she survived. In the asylum, they had a library. And my great-grandmother took advantage of the opportunity to solve the problem that no one else could. Why don't I need to eat? Why am I able to do these things? Science had no explanation for her. So she turned to the Bible. The Bible told her she was cursed. That's how she read the Bible. She did not feel loved or protected. She was very embittered over the situation. She thought she was cursed. And at some point in the asylum, my great-grandmother began to write poetry. And I have her journal of poetry. Her poetry was definitely bitter, vindictive, especially to a cheating husband, for a couple of years. And then at some point, it stopped. At some point, she started to write about the beauty of the world. She started to write about spiritual concepts of love and growth and understanding. She started to write poetry about the people she loved, tried to understand them, tried, I think, to forgive them. So we saw a change in just her writing. Even her handwriting changed. Where at the beginning, there was lots of force applied to the paper. At the end, she had beautiful calligraphy, light scrawls. I would like a font for my computer in her handwriting. So we know something, some aha moment came to her, even though no one gave her answers. Even though the doctors said what she was doing was impossible. But she still had her long sentencing. In order to get out of the asylum, at this time, she had to prove she was getting better. And that meant going along with being shocked, going along with freezing cold baths, going along with medical testing that was not quite ready yet. No lobotomies, though, not yet. That was not invented. But at some point, Martha Nash realized that nothing was actually killing her. Nothing was holding her back. She still had her strength. She still had her mind. She was not weakened in any way. Something changed, not physically in her life, but I think perspective. Her perspective changed. And that's when something happened spiritually in her life. when she realized what she was capable of the whole time. When she came home, her husband reported to the news that she was still able to cook excellent food, even though she couldn't taste. She was still able to do all of the housework and never fatigued. He even reported he tried to catch her eating, and he couldn't. He was astonished, but as her husband, I don't think he would lie about that. It's a very strange thing to lie about. He called in the reporters from Acme, like the cartoon, yeah. And they took her story and twisted it. They took her story of success, of enduring, and they said, look at this woman, she is derided, crazy, this is impossible. And now, instead of her against everyone, it was the family against everyone. Her story was published over and over 90 times in 2 countries, including in Time magazine, which led to her being featured in a museum of hoaxes. There's a museum called Ripley's Believe It or Not, but there are others. I apologize. It's time to walk the dog. So when I learned about my great-grandmother, I looked her up. I saw fraud, derided, insane, embarrassment. And that was before I read her poetry. That was before I learned her voice and her soul on paper. That was before I knew who she really was. I saw what the media told me she was. So in 1934, when these articles came out, there was a hushing in the family. Don't talk about great-grandma. But there actually was precedence for what she had discovered. It wasn't readily available, though, like we now know what we are capable of as humans when we are supported by a community that's loving and a father that's loving. We are able to do more than what the world believes we are able to do. So in 1877, 650 years prior to her experience, there was one man in Minnesota, in the United States, named Dr. Henry Tanner. He was a doctor, and he figured out if animals can hibernate all winter long and come out and they're fine, can a human? So he approached the subject from a very scientific angle, and he proved 2 times in front of live audiences of other doctors and of the media watching him that he could go foodless for 40 days. He wrote a book, more like the media wrote a book about him. And perhaps Martha knew that that book existed, maybe not. But there was also one other person, I believe, would have believed Martha's story. And that person, unfortunately, did not catch on to it until later, when she was not able to speak on her own behalf. And his name was George Clemens, and he went also by the pen name Hilton Hotema. Hilton Hotema was a dietitian as his medical practice, He looked at her case, knowing what he knows professionally, reading her newspaper interviews because she was no longer able to speak for herself. And he determined in the 1950s that her claim was valid. He determined that she discovered something that other people could discover, could know about, but that the media twisted and squashed, unfortunately. In one of his books, he wrote about her. He said, 10 years ago, a case was reported in the newspapers of a woman in St. Paul, Minnesota, who did not eat for 7 years. She was Mrs. Martha Nash, and for commercial reasons, such information is quickly smothered. He believed that my great-grandmother had more to say when she talked about, in her interviews, I don't need to eat. I don't need to drink. I don't need to do this like other people. Now, she did admit, she said, food, it does not repulse her. She just has no use for it anymore. She says in the newspaper, I feel physically well. My appearance has not changed. There were also, curiously, 3 credible witnesses to her time after the asylum to say in a statement, a sworn statement, they did not see her eat or drink. One being her husband, the other being my grandfather. My grandfather died in 2019. And while we were researching for the book that we wrote to tell her story, he held fast to his dying day. He never saw his mother eat or drink. And this to me is confusing. If what she said was untrue, why would her son, after she dies, until his dying breath, hold fast to it? Didn't make sense. I knew my grandfather was not a liar. In addition, the next door neighbor that they grew up with for 4 generations, they stayed in this neighborhood. The next door neighbor was his babysitter and the housekeeper for many years. And she swore in a testimony that no matter how many times she went in or out, she never saw Martha eat. So we have 3 people who swore to the media. And at that point of their swearing, it had been 52 days. That was longer than Dr. Tanner's feet. So for that, I'm a little impressed. For her, the cure for her was not found in medicine. It was found in her perspective and in her allowance for someone else to help her through things. Instead of being embittered and unforgiving, she had to come to understand that there's more to life than this moment or that person or that person's offense. She had to let it go. And I believe that's when her healing really started. And I know that we can see that in her writing. And all of her poems are now published so that readers can follow along on that journey. I did prepare one of her poems that she wrote. It's addressed to her little sister. She wrote some of them to specific people while she was in the asylum. And it's titled The World. It's very short and it rhymes like a nursery rhyme. She liked to do that. She likes her poetry to be musical. I think that's cool. The poem The World by Martha Nash in 1932 reads, "The world is filled with wonders and put on earth to stay. The lakes, the cliffs, and desert will never pass away. The hail, the rain, and sunshine will ever come and go. The summer with its foliage and winter covered snow. The wave upon the ocean, the shark in depths of sea, have come to stay forever, and scenes will always be. The beast within the forest, the hawk upon the wing, the lambkin in the meadow, and birds will always sing. There always will be countries, races, color, and creed. Those make up a perfect world. And war in time of need. There always will be pleasure and always will be strife, as such is God's creation within the human life." I believe that was a poem that showed incredible growth in her life, new perspective, and perhaps a sense of balance after everything she had been through that came with recognizing where her source of energy, love, where the source of forgiveness even comes from. For me personally, I can attest that my source of forgiveness is not supplied by myself. I can easily be offended. I can easily have my feelings hurt, and I know I do not have what I need by myself to make it through, especially with social media. I know that there is a bigger source of love to supply me when I feel the need. And I think she realized that as well. So for her story, despite incredible systemic pressure, negative feelings, negative opinions on her life, even though the world back then did not get to see her as an advocate, they did not get to see her healed. They did not get to see that because they kept applying the labels to her. I believe now the world will be able to see her for who she was, really, as a wonderful poet, an award-winning poet, actually, as an advocate, as a feminist, and as an incredibly strong woman of fortitude that even when electrodes were being put to her brain to change her mind, to change her truth, she never wavered. She never wavered from what she knew to be truth. And I'm really proud of her. And instead of being embarrassed by my crazy great-grandma, I am now honored to come from such a stock, to come from someone who I believe is a mold breaker. And I leave with you these words that, because she was a poet, I would encourage you to write poetry too. Poetry, at its purpose, base purpose, explores our human conditions as if our human life was an art form, which it is. But also, our lives tuned into the bigger picture of being human is very poetic. Thank you so much for having me and allowing me to tell her story and to correct misperceptions and to normalize what we think now is awesome and wonderful, and to give her that in a time when she didn't have it. If not then, now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Janelle. What a wonderful recounting of your family history, and also the history of peoples in America, and the history of Pranic living, which is what we're all here for, gathered together. I have a couple of questions. Um, there's comments as well. People are saying it's very inspiring and uplifting to hear this story and beautiful testimony. Someone would like to know, you say you've written a book about your great grandmother, about Martha. Can you give us the title and where we might get copies of that?
Yes, the book is titled Poems from the Asylum by Martha Nash. I gave her all of the credit. It is on Amazon and it is available internationally, but only in English. I don't know other languages. It has an entire biographical background. It has all of her poetry and analysis, and it also has the entire medical case study applied to the back to explain her growth and what happened in her life from a scientific perspective.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Janelle. Fabio, do we have any questions from our live audience there under the trees? I just pose that to you, and I'm going to ask another question from my end here. So, what do you think was the change that happened for Martha? You were saying that her writing shifted, her poetry and her emotions changed. What do you feel was the shift that happened for her?
It's hard to say, but it's very distinct. When I went through her poetry, suddenly it seemed almost like a different person was writing. The subject matter changed. The handwriting was lighter, more beautiful. I think a lot of it had to do with her perhaps coming to a level of acceptance of where she was at and what her life was like. The asylum constantly told her she was broken, you know, but at some point she personally realized nothing's changed. No matter what you do to change me, I am who I am. And I think that brought her some freedom emotionally. And perhaps through that, she was able, through even writing that out, she was able to process some of her bitterness and unforgiveness, because I think maybe people didn't understand her, and she got to a point where she was okay with that. It is what it is.
Beautiful. Thank you, Janelle. So other people want to know if this book is, you said you're not sure if it's in other languages. Somebody's requesting a French version. And is there also a Kindle version? Do you know?
There are no other languages at this time, and there is not a Kindle version yet.
Wonderful. Thank you, Janelle. Somebody is asking that there is a question from the live audience. I'm going to ask one more question, Fabio, and then we'll get to you. Someone is asking that is there she was growing up in a religious environment, and this change that happened, that perhaps there was a spiritual shift of some sort. And the question is, do you feel that she is spiritually connected to you and that perhaps you are completing her mission?
Wow. Perhaps I am completing her mission. Perhaps I now have the platform to finish my sentences without a male cutting them off or without a male interpreting them for me. So perhaps for that part of the question, absolutely, I am able to finish her story, and for her to be able to speak out through me is an honor. I do believe there was a spiritual awakening. In her interviews, she mentioned in her search and finding that she was only cursed. She said when she was trying to search out the meaning of all of this, she hardly ever read the Bible. She went to church as a practice. She didn't believe anything until she started to experience this on her own. So I think at some point, her spiritual life became personal and no longer cultural or behavioral. So I do believe that. I don't believe there's a spiritual connection, though. At a later point in her life, I do think she really let go of any kind of connection to any kind of church body or biblical anything, and I'm very sad about that. She, at the end of her life, began to see demons. She began to be very fearful of dying. And so I don't know what happened at some point later in her life where those things were perhaps invited and she did not have the support or resources to endure. And so for that, there is definitely a loss of connection. And I'm sad about it.
Thank you for that answer, Janelle. It's a very moving story. Fabio has a question from our live audience there. Thank you, Fabio.
Hello, my question is regarding the subject you just touched now. This is about one thing is about the departure of the body. How was it? If there is any recording of the cause of death, and I'm even interested in what you just said about this, what you call demons or psychological disbalance can be called, or however you want to describe it. And the other thing is, I like to know if there are recordings or the family members about her sleeping patterns.
Oh. I will go backwards. She did mention, she testified to not needing to sleep. Yes, she spoke about that. She said at some point it felt like a trance, and she told people that it felt like if you go to the dentist and get laughing gas, dental gas, she said she could close her eyes and rest, but she didn't need to sleep. So that was her word. Her word was trance. And as far as the demon experience, medically speaking, she had, we believe, dementia, medically speaking. But she did die from a heart attack. In her late stages, in her old age, she started to have visions that demons were coming to get her. She knew, she felt they were coming to collect her. And she would say they were climbing on the walls and they were looking at her and they were waiting for her to die so they could come get her. It was very terrifying. And my mother I never met her personally, but my mother went to visit her when she was younger, and she remembers just being very terrified because her grandmother would say, like, look, they're there. So that is very, very sad, I think, and scary. So if we go one generation further to my grandmother, the daughter-in-law, they definitely had a reconnection. My grandparents were much more faithful, much more spiritually engaged. And when my grandmother passed, I'll back up. My grandmother, my great-grandmother, and I have an ability to see, hear visions, to prophesy, to feel others' emotions and such. And I believe that's also been passed down. And so when my grandmother was dying, or in her old age, she began to see not demons. She began to see Jesus. She saw her family. She saw friends. And for her, the veil between life and death was thinner and thinner and thinner. And we could be around her, and she could see loved ones with us, around us. And so I'm very encouraged by that, to have those two different stories to show when we step away from or hold resentments against or disconnect from the love of God, versus when we stay connected and our source of life comes from God. We have very different experiences in our family. And I got to see and experience both of those through family testimonies or from my own eyes.
Thank you so much, Janelle. I want to ask another, we have, he wants to expand on that question.
Yes, the question is, as you are saying, it seems that she had a peaceful death. If you have any details, I'd like to know more, because usually heart attack is referred to as a sudden death. And and as you say,
no, Martha did not have a peaceful death. My grandmother did. My great grandmother did not. It was very fearful and anxiety full.
Yeah. Thank you, Janelle. I want to just ask another question for clarification, that when she was going into the asylum, she had already, you mentioned a 7-year period. And so this is what was documented and publicized in, I guess, by journalists.
Mm-hmm.
But did she continue to not eat through her life?
That is a good question. Yes and no. I do know that when she reached about 60, she gained a lot of weight, as many women in menopause can do. But I think she normalized eventually. She married a new husband who loved and appreciated her and protected her and provided for her. So I think in that healthier relationship, there may have been more eating. But it's very hard for us to say that she went fully one way, this way or that way. There are no stories other than my grandfather saying to his dying day, she never ate. No surviving stories besides his immediate testimony.
Great. Thank you, Janelle. Another question is, how has her story affected you in your life, regarding your beliefs about the necessity to consume food or not?
Well, I personally understand that when some of our primal needs are no longer being given to us, met with $1 at the vending machine, we begin to pursue more advanced needs. And know that when we are struggling, we seek greater support outside of our circumstances. I know that when I feel lonely or at a loss, I start to seek support from God. I start to find peace through prayer and my spiritual discipline. So I know these things are true and effective. But I also love cheese and fruit. I am a vegetarian for the most part. I am happy with that. I've been a vegetarian for 15 years. And I'm okay with that.
That's beautiful. We're all okay with that. So I think we're pretty much at our time now. And if there were any last things that you wanted to share with us, or things that you wanted to say to close off, feel free. Janelle, thank you so much.
Yes. So the book is available on Amazon. It's in the chat. And I did include my Facebook page. It is at 7 Years Insane, which is the story that we are breaking. That she was not insane. She was whole, healthy, fine the whole time. So if you want to learn more or follow along, we would love to have you.
Thank you so much, Janelle. As we know here at the Eden Pranic Center, and those of us who have gone on this pranic path can attest, there are many of us who are doing perfectly well in this kind of lifestyle. So thank you so much for validating and sharing your great-grandmother's story with us. It's very inspirational, and also really touches my heart. So thank you so much for sharing with us, Janelle. Thank you everyone for joining online and in person here at the Pranic World Festival, here at Eden Pranic Center in Cuore, Italy. We've got the last day and the last speaker left to join us. So stick around for another hour and we'll be closing up our festivities here. Thanks again, Janelle.
Mm-hmm.